Okay, so my name is Paul O'Connor. I'm the advocacy manager here at the Pat Finucane Centre. I'm based at the Derry office, and we also have offices in Armagh, Belfast, and we have a caseworker in Dublin with Justice for the Forgotten, which is now part of the Pat Finucane Centre. That's the organisation that basically provides support to families south of the border. And we provide advocacy support north of the border. We don't approach families, they approach us. And they're generally people who've got unanswered questions about the loss of a loved one during the conflict. We also support a small number of torture victims, and including some of the waterboarding victims from the early 70s in Belfast.
Okay. Now, coming up to the 24th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, the agreement itself said that we must never forget those who died or injured and their families. We must honour them as best we can. How do you think they have been honoured in those 24 years?
Unsurprisingly, I mean, I think that's one of the many unfulfilled promises of the Good Friday Agreement. They certainly haven't been. And what we've seen are various British administrations simply kicking the can down the road. They don't want to deal with it. It could have been dealt with many, many years ago. I find it striking. Just the other day, we happened to be in an event in Dublin, and we were talking to Robin Eames, and we were reflecting back on the Eames-Bradley engagement and the proposals that they came up with at the time, which would have worked. And you know, that's more than a decade ago. And in many ways, these outstanding issues, although they're difficult, they could have been resolved by now. It could be over by now. And, you know, to be quite honest, I wouldn't mind being out of a job. Any of us wouldn't, if it meant that those issues would have been resolved. And so they just keep kicking it down the road. But obviously now, with the command paper that was issued last summer, I think they're making a very determined effort at this stage to completely close it down.
And when you say the issues haven't been resolved, is it possible to say what resolve looks like, or how would that feel for people?
I think resolved, what it looks like is having a mechanism that is capable of carrying out rigorous, independent Article 2 investigations into deaths arising from the conflict and providing information to families. And that has to be a mechanism that has trust right across the board, across various communities in various sectors. And, you know, this has been proposed a number of times, and then it was proposed within the Stormont House Agreement of the HIU. And on repeated occasions, you know, we have agreements that are made, and then the agreements are broken. We often make the point that this is not rocket science. It's not actually that difficult to resolve a lot of these issues. Others, and they're usually people that are not directly involved, will come up with various arguments. For instance, that the IRA, for instance, didn't keep records. And so the inference is they didn't keep records, but the British government did, and so it's a one-sided issue. But of course, I mean, we probably more than most have experience of looking at British records, and a lot of the British records are actually about the IRA. So that's a nonsensical argument. And obviously there's also nuggets within that in terms of things that have been inadvertently left in the files about their own actions, or where they're talking to each other and they never really thought that someone else might be looking at what they're reading. So it's not rocket science to deal with a lot of these issues and to go off and try to get some honest answers for families. And I've been in many, many situations where families have dealt with sometimes with the LIB, the Legacy Investigations Branch of the police, or with the Historical Inquiries team, or with the Police Ombudsman, or with the Operation Canova team, whatever it might be. And if families feel they're being treated with honesty and integrity, they do react to that. And so I do think it can be resolved if there's a will. I no longer believe that there is a will there. on the British side whatsoever.
And if it's so uncomplicated, why do they lack the will? Is it obvious why they lack the will? They're afraid of what might come out about their own actions in the past, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is. I mean, in some ways, you almost have to admire success with British governments, because wherever it is, they've ensured that there's no accountability for their actions, no matter where it is. There was, you know, whether it was in the 1950s with photographs being published in the British press showing British police officers in Malaya standing with the severed heads of so-called communist insurgents, and there's no kickback. Nothing happens. You know, people think it was Al Qaeda started cutting people's heads off. Well, actually, the British were doing it in Malaya in the 1950s in the so-called emergency, and no kickback. Or whether it was the camps in Kenya, and quite a lot of evidence emerged at the time of what was happening in Kenya, but nothing happened. Or the torture in Cyprus, or what's happened here with the hooded men, shoot to kill policy, and so on. They have absolutely ensured that there is no accountability. So, you know, the shocking statistic here is that 4 soldiers were found guilty of murder during the conflict. All 4 were given life sentences. All of them were released early using the Queen's pardon as a mechanism, and all of them were readmitted to the British Army. Now, there's no other NATO country, G7 country, whatever, allows that to happen, that someone who's found guilty of murder is allowed to return to the armed forces. So they have been absolutely consistent in ensuring that there is that there is impunity in effect. And, you know, we've seen that with the overseas bill that was passed 2 years ago to basically close down investigations into Iraq and Afghanistan. And during the Bloody Sunday weekend this year, we had a former lieutenant colonel in the British Army who was the most senior legal officer on the ground in Iraq. And he said that there was massive Article 2 violations, and that it was an absolute disgrace that they closed it down. And that's what they intend to do here.
I mean, even before the announcement in July last year of this proposed amnesty, as you said yourself, there's only a small number, 4 soldiers who've been prosecuted. So was there a de facto amnesty in place, or has there been one in place for a long time?
Absolutely, and that was facilitated in the early days in what was a secret and illegal agreement that we actually found between the General Officer Command of the British Army and the Chief Constable of the RUC at the time, which ensured that the RUC did not investigate killings of civilians by the military. The intention was that the RUC would only interview the civilian witnesses and the military would interview the military witnesses. In actual fact, 2 things happened. The RUC did not interview the civilian witnesses. And when the Royal Military Police spoke to soldiers after fatal shootings, they themselves admitted at the Bloody Sunday inquiry that they did so with a view for administrative purposes, but not in order to ascertain whether there'd been criminal wrongdoing. So none of these cases were actually properly investigated. And we're involved in an ongoing row at the moment with the Northern Ireland office because we've refused a number of recent meetings, most recently just a couple of weeks ago. And this is the only Secretary of State that we haven't met in maybe 25 years. And the reason we've done that is because they have claimed that the vast majority of security force killings were lawful. We've made the point that there are legal judgments to the effect that in fact these killings were not investigated. If they weren't investigated, it follows that it cannot be claimed that they were lawful.
Okay, now that idea of killings being lawful, it opens up I suppose, even another can of worms, you might say, where one group of people said they were fighting a war. Republicans say they were fighting a war. The British deny that there was a war. If there was no war, there's an inherent contradiction there. If the British say they weren't fighting a war, then how could these killings have been lawful? You've touched on it there already.
Precisely, but not only if they weren't fighting a war, how could they have been lawful? But if they weren't fighting a war, how could they delegate the absolute responsibility on the police to investigate every death? And I mean, we we have cases, Peadar, it's really quite shocking sometimes, where the police never even attended the scene of the incident where a civilian was shot dead, particularly in Belfast in the early 70s, where they simply didn't attend the scene. They gave evidence that they went to the morgue and were there when the family identified the body and so on, but they didn't seal off the scene, they didn't do any measurements, they didn't gather evidence. And I'm not speaking of a no-go situation, say like in Derry in the early 70s, but in situations where they did have access in North Belfast and elsewhere, but they simply failed to do it and failed to interview witnesses. And so I think it's a major quandary for them, because we've challenged them on this. We've sent them the legal documents. One is the Thompson judgment, and the other is a recent attempt to prosecute 2 paratroopers for the shooting of Joe McCann. And we were involved in that case, and we were involved in a case where a former soldier was being prosecuted for the murder of John Pat Cunningham. And I describe it as the judgment in the McCann case. Basically, that prosecution of those 2 soldiers was ended because the judge said that the statements given to the Royal Military Police at the time by the paratroopers, where they admit shooting him, were not admissible as evidence because they did not have the benefit of legal support when they gave those statements. Now, if you think about that, many people, particularly in the 1970s, didn't have the benefit of any lawyer when admissions were beaten out of them in Castlereagh or Ballykelly. And when they said to the trial judge, well, my lord, I was beaten senseless when I signed that, they simply weren't believed. Or maybe they were believed, but the judge didn't really care at the time. So that there's an irony in all of that. But the other irony is that the fact that a judge has now said that Royal Military Police statements are inadmissible in cases means that you have a circle of inequality, you have a circle of injustice. They set it up in the 1970s that they deliberately did not gather evidence and deliberately did not impose the rule of law when it came to their own actions. And they're now using their deliberate failings and these illegal agreements to say that those statements cannot be used. So that leads to a situation where, for instance, when you look at the case of Soldier F, and I'll be careful what I say because that case is again live, but Soldier F's original statement to the Royal Military Police after Bloody Sunday and his statement to the Widgery Tribunal cannot be used. His statements to Savile cannot be used because they had a form of impunity for any evidence he gave to Savile, and so it completes this circle, and families are looking on and saying, well, one thing is absolutely clear: we do not live in a democratic society where there is rule of law and where all citizens are treated equally.
Okay. Now, earlier on this year, we had reports from the Ombudsman's Office into collusion, apparent collusion between members of the police force and loyalist paramilitaries. How important are those reports, despite the fact that this amnesty, proposed amnesty, is hanging over us? How important are those reports? And as well as you mentioned, the quashing, the High Court's decision to quash what had been decided previously on Soldier F, how important are those for victims' families?
Well, the report, particularly up here in the Northwest, was a very important report. It covered quite a large series of murders at a period where it was clear that the UDA in particular was benefiting from much better sources of information. And so instead of simply targeting Catholic civilians, they were targeting members of Sinn Féin, Eddie Fullerton and others, and members of the IRA. And it was quite clear that information was coming from inside the security forces. So you mentioned the case of collusion with police officers, but it also included a significant number of members of the UDR in this area, in Derry and Antrim. And of course, it included the attacks in Donegal and Eddie Fullerton. Deeply significant, because what they show is it vindicates and acknowledges what those families and communities have known instinctively, that there was something terribly wrong at that time and incredibly dangerous in terms of what was happening in Target in the late 1980s, early 1990s. But I think it also shows a wider audience and patterns that are repeated. They're repeated in Loughlin Island. They've been repeated in Glenanne in the 1970s. They're repeated in Belfast with the Ormo bookies and so on. And, you know, if you have repeated patterns of so-called rotten apples all over the barrel, you know, it leads you to one absolute conclusion, and that is it's not rotten apples, it's a barrel full of rotten apples, and there are some good ones there. We've said that repeatedly, and we've said it in respect of Glenanne, that there were decent police officers who did their best to try and investigate some of these issues, but they were constantly being blocked by special branch and by the necessity of counterinsurgency and political policing. So I think it's very, very significant, because we cannot allow it to pass that it was simply a matter of a few bad apples. It's absolutely clear that there was a policy. And we have never said that everybody followed this policy, everybody was party to it, or everybody was involved in it. Not at all. It never works like that. But there were clearly elements within both the British Army, the Force Research Unit, within the RUC, Special Branch, and within the Security Service, who were directing activities at different times. At times, they were simply turning a blind eye to what was happening. And, you know, we have a 20-year period, and we make this point repeatedly, when the largest loyalist paramilitary group was legal. They were not illegal. The UDA were not illegal when they shot Pat Finucane. They were a legal organization which people could join. And, you know, I think there's no greater example of impunity. And we are constantly saying, particularly to people within the media, to refrain from using the phrase UFF, because the UFF never existed. And we have dozens and dozens of British documents which make that point, that they themselves didn't believe that the UFF existed. So I think such reports and such things as the recent court victory in terms of Soldier F are massively important for families, because it's simply not good enough for the prosecution service to say, well, we're going to terminate this prosecution. Those are decisions that should correctly be made by a trial judge as to whether the evidence is admissible. And I think that's what's going to happen now.
Okay. And what about the role of the Irish government? This amnesty being brought forward by the British government. The Irish government were party to the Good Friday Agreement and other agreements since then. Is there more that they could or should be doing at this time to put pressure on the British government? Well,
there's a lot the Irish government could be doing, and the single most important thing that the Irish government could be doing is unlocking this bizarre situation whereby the Garda Síochána and the Department of Justice are not sharing information that they have about the Dublin and Monaghan bombings and other attacks in the Republic of Ireland with the Operation Canova team led by John Boucher. And that particular investigation is called Operation Denton. And we have a situation at the moment where there was to be a sharing of documents, and then at the last minute that was stopped. And there's been a bit of a battle back and forth. We've made this point when Margaret Irwin, who is our caseworker for Justice for the Forgotten, gave evidence recently at a Dáil committee, that it's a bizarre situation that we've had 3 Dáil motions supported by all parties in Dáil Éireann, calling on the British government to carry out a proper investigation into the Dublin and Monaghan bombings. And now, where there is an investigative mechanism in the north, the Gardaí are actually not sharing information. And so that is the absolute priority, is for that blockage to be removed. Now, there are developments in that, and there are attempts to unblock it at this point in time, and hopefully that will be successful. And hopefully by the anniversary this year on May 17th, there will be some better news on that front.
Okay. And what work would the Pat Finucane Centre do with other victims campaign groups from possibly other parts of the community in the north?
Well, I mean, we have very good relations with a number of groups. For instance, we would refer people to other groups because we do not, and we do this deliberately, we do not have the expertise to provide trauma counselling. And we don't think we should engage in areas where we're not properly trained on that. And, you know, obviously, we've been supportive of other campaigns, whether it's the Ballymurphy families or Loughlin Island or the Bloody Sunday families and so on. And then again, families are sometimes referred to us from others, and if we can help and give pointers on where they might go to look for more information to get answers to the questions, we're happy to do that. We would certainly be of the view that everybody is now suffering under the set of proposals that are on the table from the British government. So during the Bloody Sunday weekend, we invited representatives from the Shankill bombings, from the Omagh bombings, Bloody Sunday and Spring Hill massacre to come together in a Zoom event to talk about the British government proposals, because all of those people, whether they're victims of Republican violence, Loyalist violence or British state violence, everyone will suffer if these proposals are enacted as envisaged. And we can't move forward with only one group of people getting answers. Everybody deserves answers.
Okay.
We would be of the view that everyone has been responsible for human rights violations over the past 40 years, Republicans, Loyalists and the state.
Okay. And kind of to finish on a crystal ball type question, where do you see it going from here? I mean, are those amnesty proposals realistically going to become law?
I don't think the full package that they announced last summer is going to become law. I think that was Boris Johnson and people in Number 10 who were talking to their backbenchers, you know, the military wing of the Tory party, and fulfilling their wish list and putting everything in a statement. And then by the time the echo came back from Belfast, from political parties, the Irish government, the groups working in the sector, and even I think some people within the NIO, I think they realised that if they were to go forward with a full package, they would really be facing a massive revolt. So I don't think everything that they've announced will be enacted. I think they will compromise, possibly around inquests, possibly around civil actions. It remains to be seen what they'll do about historic investigations being carried out by the Ombudsman, because it's abundantly clear that the retired police associations are very, very unhappy about those investigations and are constantly attempting to block those investigations, which is its own bitter irony that people that spent their entire professional career demanding that other people answer questions are themselves refusing to answer questions into what they might have done. So crystal ball, I do believe they will do everything possible to stop prosecutions. Whether the rest of the package will be brought forward as proposed last summer, I would have my doubts.